When I went to North Korea the first time almost 40 years ago in 1981, they kept talking about a new relationship with the U.S. It's what they've wanted for a very long time. And their people know that. I'm Bruce Cumings. I teach in the history department at the University of Chicago. I teach modern Korean history and East Asian history, also U.S. relations with East Asia in the modern period. North Korea was one of the most rapidly growing countries in the world after the Korean War for about 20 years. It had double-digit growth. And into the late 1970s, North Korea's per capita GNP was higher than the South's, which is hard today to understand. I visited there in 1987, and the bulletin actually covered my visit. In 1987, I think the North Korean economy was probably at a high point. It was the only time I've been there that I was allowed to walk around by myself. I talked to ordinary people. I mean, they're not going to tell a Caucasian foreigner anything that the regime doesn't want them to say. But I was impressed with the economy at that time. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the North lost its subsidized oil and various other imports from Moscow that had basically been propping up the economy. And their industrial economy also creaked to a halt. Basically, the whole economy collapsed in the mid and late 90s. And they were forced then to move to rudimentary markets, barter markets, where people would trade a pair of shoes for a bag of rice, that kind of thing. So North Korea has really been poised for some time to move in the direction that Vietnam and China have, of essentially a market allocated economy within a communist system with the Communist Party and still in charge. And I think that's what Kim Jong-un wants to do now. I think he just needs protection from South Korea and the United States in order to move in that direction so that his rule isn't threatened. The U.S. introduced nuclear weapons to South Korea in 1958 and kept hundreds of nuclear weapons, including even nuclear landmines, until 1991 when George H.W. Bush removed them. With the collapse of the Soviet Union and with China recognizing South Korea and developing a broad relationship with Seoul in the early 90s, I think the North began to see that they needed to move toward at least faking a nuclear weapon, if not developing one, in order to get attention from the United States. And they did that. The North started importing from Pakistan aluminum centrifuges. First, I think in 1998, it got more blatant in 2002. And that was the excuse the Bush administration used to break out of the freeze. But William Perry, who was in charge of the sort of North Korea policy of the last 2 years of the Clinton administration, has said many times that we had the plutonium nailed down. We were getting their medium and long-range missiles nailed down in 2000. And we worry about the enriched uranium later because they had demonstrated no ability to highly enrich uranium, let alone make a uranium bomb. And they still haven't, by the way. You nail down what you can nail down. But by ignoring that very important advice from this former Defense Secretary Perry, the Bush administration created a situation where when they invaded Iraq and knocked over Saddam Hussein and his regime, the North just immediately started saying if he had had nuclear weapons, this wouldn't have happened. So we're going to build our deterrent. And they said it over and over again. They even showed metallized plutonium in a jar to Americans like Sig Hecker from Stanford to show their deterrent. And then in 2006, they exploded their first small nuclear weapon. When Kim Jong-un in November of 2017, he said, we've completed our nuclear arsenal, I thought they were going to keep it. And that we were in for a very long process of either containment and deterrence or the possibility of an American preemptive strike on North Korea. The New Year's address just cut through all that tension. I mean, it's hard now to remember how high the tension was, President Trump, in September at the UN, threatened to totally destroy North Korea. He threatened many times fire and fury and this, that, and the other. But the New Year's speech really was just like letting the air out of a balloon. And even though he talked about completing their nuclear arsenal, he also talked about reconciling with the South and implied a new relationship with the United States. And ever since, I mean, we've had 6 months now to observe what's going on with a flurry of diplomacy. It seems every major leader in the world now wants to meet with Kim Jong-un. He met with Xi Jinping for the first time. He's going to meet Putin. He's going to meet Trump. It seems that they may be willing to give it up again if they can get very solid guarantees of their own security. And I think what is likely to happen is that North Korea will agree to a long-term moratorium on testing bombs and missiles. And they may be willing to have their plutonium shipped out of the country. Maybe they're willing to mothball their missiles in some way, stop producing them and selling them. I say that because they did all that in the 1990s. They didn't ship their plutonium out. That's one thing they didn't do, but otherwise they froze their plutonium. And William Perry had negotiated a missile deal on their medium and long-range missiles in late 2000 that would have worked if the Bush administration had gone through with it, in return for normalization of relations with the U.S. and quite a bit of aid. I think it would have been about $1 billion a year. But completely worth it. I mean, we spend tens of billions of dollars every year in deterring North Korea, either in South Korea or our 3rd Marine Division in Okinawa and our 50,000 troops in Japan more generally. Those are all basically to deter North Korea, and it would have been pocket change to buy out their missiles. So it's a real tragedy that that didn't happen. But we're back at a similar point now. And given what North Korea's been willing to do in the past, maybe they're also willing to do it in the future. You know, the North Koreans are not crazy. They're not insane. They actually very carefully calculate everything that they do. I used to write down the statements about Kim Il-sung being crazy, or he had a boil on his neck. It was really a brain tumor. This is a calcium deposit that was a result of poor nutrition as a little kid. That's essentially what it was. But they managed to get the Western press to talk about this over and over again. And then Kim Jong-il was supposed to be crazy. And he looked a little crazy because he was the only person in North Korea who wore a $29.95 Walmart ski coat and sunglasses. But then Madeleine Albright met him and said he was perfectly reasonable, very well informed, knew exactly what he was doing. And it happens every time. Kim Jong-un has been more caricatured than anybody because the North Koreans have shaved his sides of his head to make him look like his grandfather back in the 1940s. And it's patent what they're doing, but people think Kim Jong-un must be crazy. And then he gives his New Year's address, and he comes to the summit with South Korea, and he's a perfect statesman, very dignified, knew what he was doing, and all of a sudden, I'm wondering, what are people thinking? You know, in the night of our ignorance, we know nothing about North Korea. And it's very dangerous that people in every administration also perpetuate this. The real wild card in this, as in almost everything these days, is President Trump. I don't really know, even on the eve of the summit, what Donald Trump is going to do. But I think one thing one can say with certainty is that Trump is not beholden to the foreign policy establishment inside the Beltway, which has basically had a bipartisan policy toward North Korea of either demanding that it give up all of its nuclear weapons and missiles, or that it collapse, preferably on American time rather than North Korea time. This has been going on through every Democratic and Republican administration for 25 years. Back in the 1990s, when you talked to officials who were negotiating with North Korea or had been, you found that they had a very long laundry list of what they expected North Korea to do sooner or later. Human rights was a major aspect of the Clinton concerns about North Korea, chemical and biological weapons, the Japanese hostages that they apparently have, which are very important to Abe and the Japanese, exporting of amphetamines and other kinds of drugs. The laundry list was very long. When you got down to the bottom of it, it was almost as if they wanted a complete change of regime, which is, of course, what they did want. And I always wondered where things would, where the line would be drawn. I think the Achilles heel of this summit is that if the professional diplomats get involved on our side, they're going to have all kinds of things they want the North Koreans to do before we will give them aid or normalize relations. We have to be reasonable in what we expect from the North Koreans unless we are trying to change the regime. If we're going to accept North Korea as it is, which was Perry's position, rather than as we would like it to be, then we have to stop at some point with endless demands and give them something in return. And then Trump, who was completely naive about the way the North Koreans negotiate, doesn't know any of this history, in my view, and constantly is engaged in keeping people off balance. And I think that it's that quality of Trump that will put him in trouble with the North Koreans, because they'll be paying very close attention to what they want and what they know, and he'll be flip-flopping. I don't have any way to predict what's likely to happen. It's hard enough to explain the past without predicting the future, and eminently hard with President Trump. I mean, I've spent most of my career trying to get people to understand that the North Koreans are rational people who, from their own standpoint and from their own beliefs and ideology and assumptions and all of that, are doing what they want to do and know what they're doing. But maybe it's only at times like this that people, particularly in the United States, can look at North Korea and keep their minds open.